All right, so we are here today for another one of our lab's fireside chats for Consensys hackathon that's going on with Gitcoin and Microsoft. And we have with us today Londa Overbeck from Lyft, who is graciously giving us some of her time to talk to us about her expertise in user experience research and design research, and how it might apply to some of the projects you're working on in your hackathon this week and next. So Londa, do you want to go ahead and just give us a quick introduction about who you are and your kind of background, and then we'll get started?
Sure. Yeah, I am a user researcher and currently at Lyft, as you said, have also worked as a consultant with Katie and with Zach, and also in education technology field. And prior to that, I was a psychotherapist. So my background is in psychology and social work, and kind of pivoted leveraging my clinical skills towards user research.
Yes, it sounds like you kind of found your way into tech the last couple of years. I guess it's a little bit longer than the last couple of years.
Yeah, I guess it's been about 6 years.
Yeah, awesome. All right, so let's get started. We'll keep this pretty short. I think it'll be about 20 minutes in length. I want you to just start off by talking to me a little bit about qualitative research and kind of the role that it plays in the broader arc of like a product or service business that's kind of coming to fruition.
Yeah, so qualitative research is really good for helping understand the why behind behavior. So, it could be answering any question from like before you even have a product idea, like who are our users, what are their needs, so that you can come up with ideas that are solving problems that people actually are grappling with. Or if it's at the stage where you're coming up with different concepts to explore, you can vet them with users to figure out what the best direction is. Or if it's further down the road and you want to evaluate how well a solution is doing with users, then you can do more like usability testing down the road. Another thing I would say that's important about qualitative research is that when it's dovetailed with other kinds of research, it can be even stronger. So you want to kind of triangulate the data, so you can marry it with quantitative research or with data science or competitive data, other things like that.
Yeah, can you talk a little bit about the difference between qualitative and quantitative research, and just kind of like the numbers that you're talking about in terms of kinds of data you're gathering, and the numbers and size and all that kind of jazz?
Yeah, so quantitative research really helps you answer the question like how many and how much, those kinds of questions. So you can look at, what does this problem look like at scale? How many of our users are struggling with X, Y, and Z? Or how many of our users are using this kind of product? And then the why can help you understand kind of what's behind those numbers.
Cool. So typically, what's the size of a qualitative research study compared to a quantitative study?
Yeah, so qualitatively, I would say varies between like 6 and 10 users for a qualitative study. It depends on how many variables you want to look at. So the more ways that you want to slice the data, the more users you'll need. So if you're comparing multiple groups, then you'll need to have like 3 or 4 from each group just to have enough of a sample to see a trend.
That makes sense. And it sounds like you say that qualitative research can be kind of built in at different points of the life cycle of a product. So it's never too early or too late, it sounds like, to do qualitative or quantitative research.
Yes, absolutely. It can really be throughout the whole life cycle.
Okay, cool. So you mentioned that you've kind of done this role in a lot of different contexts. So externally as a consultant working for companies on the outside, and then inside education in an education kind of domain, and now at Lyft. Can you talk a little bit about kind of how it looks to, sell into a company qualitative research or research in general, and kind of in terms of the different companies' interests and buy-in and kind of their feelings around qualitative research and how that plays into the overall momentum of a product or development cycle?
Yeah, so the context that you're doing research in very much matters and informs how much time you have to spend selling it. So at Lyft, at least with the team that I'm on, there is a huge amount of buy-in for research. It's very much valued. People turn to me to help inform business decisions all the time. I have to kind of ruthlessly prioritize and say no to a lot of requests because of that. But I don't have to spend much time selling it. People actually like care a lot less about the methods than like, what did we learn and what should we do about it? But when I was consulting, we were often in companies that were very low on the UX maturity spectrum. And so you're kind of starting with like, what is research and what questions can this answer and what value will it bring? and you end up spending like a huge part of your time selling it, which means you have less time to actually do the actual work. So it's kind of a balancing act between those two things, depending on the maturity level of the company that you're in.
Yeah. So if you're, say, starting a new company, today or this week, and you've got a handful of people on your team, how would you go about making sure that that's baked into the culture from the beginning? It sounds like at Lyft, it's kind of baked in, which sounds like it's a lot nicer in terms of actually using the research that you're doing on a regular basis.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot of just seeing the value through doing. I would say that the quicker you can kind of jump in and just give people that lived experience, and less kind of verbal selling on a conceptual level, the more headway you'll make. So, if you're running interviews, for example, or even just going and watching people, depending on the environment, the problem that you're trying to study, just bringing people along with you so you can all share that experience and make sense of things together. I think that can go a long way.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm sure that when you do these kind of big, long studies or immersive kind of studies where you're out living side by side with someone, you have a lot of data. How do you even start going through data like that? Like, how do you get started?
Yeah. So before even getting to data collection, one thing that I think is important, both for the selling the value side of things and making sense of the data, is making sure that you're articulating your hypotheses. So what do you have your research questions, what do we want to learn? And then you're really clear on what do we think is going to happen and how confident are we in each of these hypotheses. So then you can vet your learnings against what you really thought before going into it. And then in terms of making sense of the data, I think this is where it gets really messy, and there actually is a lot of art. It's the more challenging side of things compared to data collect. I think people often focus on, I have to sit with this person and ask these questions, and there's a lot of nerves around the data collection side of things, but I think the complexity really lives in the synthesis, and to make sure that you give yourself enough time to really make sense of things. And, you can start with affinity diagramming could be one accessible way to start to look at your data, where you just look at what are the key learnings and map things out on Post-its and then cluster like things together so that you can find the themes. And you can also just, take a lot of notes and record everything along the way so you can go back and revisit the raw material, and revisit your research questions and your hypotheses as kind of anchor points for what you want to extract.
Yeah, I think in my own practice, one of the hardest things to kind of become a master at has been kind of synthesis on the go, right? Especially when we were consulting, I feel like there's a lot of pressure to kind of do synthesis as we were doing research. But I think for, people who are just getting started, that raw data piece is so important, because the contextualized information is so key when you're coming back to it later, especially even weeks or months later, saying, I think they said something about the way that onboarding mattered to them in a new blockchain program, right? But really getting back in there and being able to re-immerse yourself in the contextualized data in the moment is so important, so that you're not kind of drawing those conclusions or remembering things incorrectly or having biases kind of creeping in. So yeah. I think even though a lot of the really, really talented researchers that I know can do some level of what I would call synthesis on the go, I recommend, and I'll be curious to hear your take on that, just taking as much raw contextual data as you possibly can, be that photos, videos, audio recording, verbatim notes, whatever it takes to make sure that you've got it for later.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think both are often at play. It's not necessarily like a one or the other thing. Like sometimes what I'll do, which I guess you could call it more synthesis on the go, is create like a little debrief template. So after each session, you'll debrief with your stakeholders, like what surprised us, what were the pain points, whatever the categories are that represent what you want to learn, so that you're already summarizing each individual, and then you can go back and kind of cross-synthesize across participants later. And I think the amount of nuance that you need to dig into also depends on kind of the question that you're trying to answer. If it's like a quick usability study, it's easier to kind of flag things as you go. Or even kind of mark it in a spreadsheet, like, did they notice this or not? Some of it's even binary. So depends on the nature of the problem.
Yeah, you've mentioned a couple of times this concept of research questions and hypotheses. How do you, in your practice, kind of come up with those and then prioritize which ones get to go first? And how many is a good number for a study, I guess?
A number of research questions?
Yeah, I mean, can you have 100 or is it better to have one or two?
Yeah, definitely not 100, somewhere between 2 and 100. Yeah, no, I think that shaping the right question is really important, and that can be done in conversation. So I think starting with what do you want to learn, and then you can kind of like approach it from different angles, like what are the decisions that we want to make? If we knew the answer to these questions, what decision would it enable? That can also help refine the research question of like, well, actually, maybe this isn't that important because there's no decision attached to it. So I think the more you can crystallize and prioritize the key questions, then the better off you can scope your study to really focus on those in depth. There's a trade-off between the more questions, the more you're kind of like scratching the surface of a lot of things. So definitely don't, overpack your study, or you'll just kind of water down the learnings. And the other thing in terms of prioritization, we focus on our OKRs, like what are our objectives that we're really measured against. So, is it cutting costs? Is it, growing your fleet? What is the thing that you're really held accountable to for the quarter? And then prioritizing against those objectives.
Cool. So your research questions always kind of tie back into those objectives at any given time.
Yeah, definitely. And then, then your objectives have the key metrics. So after a research study, you want to track what decisions were made as a result of it. And then ultimately, like sometimes there's a long time period between the research and knowing the impact of the research, but that's a really important thing to stay in tune with. So when the product launches that was influenced by the research, like what were the results? How did the metrics move as a result of it? And I think that all ties back into the, like, how do you sell people on the value of research, is being able to have those stories.
Yeah, when people ask me kind of what keeps me up at night in the research practice, it's always impact. I think it's easy for us to think that research is just a place to kind of like spend time and not be able to decipher whether or not it was useful. And I personally really want in my practice it to be very clear that research moved the needle, as you said, somewhere.
Yeah.
So I'm going to ask you, I'm going to tell you up front that this next question is totally unfair and I expect you to answer it however you want, but because I'm not going to give you enough context to answer it, but imagine that you're now consulting to one of our hackathon teams, right? They just kicked off, they're working vaguely in a space that's challenging finance, like the way finance operates today, right? So like, for example, the fact that you can't contest your credit score, or the fact that you can't group communal credit into one pool so that you could potentially, for example, with your whole block, buy a new, set of trees for your block or something like that, right? Like these are basically tenets of the current financial system in the United States that we're asking our teams to kind of overthrow or challenge. So I realize that's not enough context because they could be building something that helps someone get a mortgage or help someone who doesn't have credit get access to a credit card for the first time, or anything like that, right? But if you imagine that they're trying to do some version of starting a company in that space and they have 15 days to get started and you were consulting to them on user research, what kind of methods would you recommend, and kind of like how much time should they be spending on that versus like writing code versus writing a pitch deck? Kind of how do all those things kind of go together in your mind?
Yeah. What's the deliverable at the end of 2 weeks?
Some version of the product, what we're calling the product, but that could be wireframes, that could be a landing page, it could be napkins, it could be photos of napkins, or it could be production code, depending on what they want. And then what we're calling kind of potential, which would be some version of like a pitch, a report, a deck, a video, something that tells us where they think this thing is going. So that's what we're asking for.
Okay. And are they coming in with knowledge around the problem space that they're solving for?
Many of them are coming in. Some of them have some expertise in the space that they're in. We're actually hoping to get new people into the space that are not, for example, Web3 or blockchain experts, and instead are experts in the domain that we're asking them to come from. But imagine on any given team, you might have one person who's got expertise in that area on a team of 4 or something like that. So most of the team is more on the technical side.
Okay, so it's more like you have the subject matter experts, but not necessarily the user perspective.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, so some thoughts are like, if you can carve out some space on the front end to do some research that informs this, and they don't have a solution yet, is that right?
That's
okay.
right.
So some research on the front end that's going to help you figure out like what solution is going to solve the problems that users are having. I think oftentimes like the biggest time suck with research is recruiting. So as much as you can take that out of the equation, I think that would save you time. So I don't know if you can do intercepts at a bank, or like think of like, where do people who are grappling with the kind of finance problem that we're thinking about, where might they live? So we can just go and like chat with them without having to do a heavy lift on the recruiting side of things. Or if you could plan your recruiting in advance and invite people to come to the hackathon space or wherever people are at, and then interview them from there. But as much as you can kind of kick things off with some sort of interviews, or even looking at like analogous industries. So like if we're looking at a constraint around X, Y, and Z, like what's another industry that's grappling with a similar problem, even if it's in a totally different space, that can sometimes like free up your mind to think of solutions that might not just be something that you would come to otherwise.
Right. So for example, if you're talking about someone who's trying to get a home loan for the first time and it's hard to access those people or find where they even are, potentially you could look at students who maybe are also taking out a loan for school, but maybe also have to get a credit card to buy books or pay for food or life on the side of school. So you've got a loan and then you've got kind of a credit card situation, both of which need credit and proof that you're going to pay it back and a cosign potentially and all those kinds of other things.
Yeah. Yeah. That sounds good.
Cool. Yeah, that makes, I love that kind of analogous. I've been shocked in my own career how much I come from aviation and how much like aviation itself and flight deck computers impacts other industries like autonomous vehicles and other stuff like that. So I think you're absolutely right about kind of the parallel and the intercept piece as well. I mean, if you're looking for people who bought a home or who are in the process of buying a home loan, tracking those people down on a Saturday outside the house they're trying to purchase might not be the best place to look for people, but you might be able to reach out to your network and say like, has anyone in my network bought a home in the last 2 years? And ask them about their mortgage experience. I love that idea.
Another example, and I can't go into detail on this, but like we were looking at pricing and instead of just looking at like our direct competitors and how do they price things, or kind of in addition to that, we also looked at like, well, how are cell phones structuring their pricing? Because it was, both of them were connecting price to usage. So we were like, what industries connect price to usage? And that sort of we ended up kind of generating an idea that put us in a different direction.
Interesting. Yeah, it's like a non-parallel universe, but it is analogous as to your point.
Yeah.
We're coming to the end of our time here, so I just want to ask a couple more questions.
Can I say one more thing? Because
sure.
We did a hackathon like this, and I led engineers through the research process. We went to another market to look at drivers and what their experiences are, and then so the first 3 days were research, the last 2 days were a hackathon. The thing that I think is super important with the hackathon is not only doing the research up front, but then doing some concept testing once you get your ideas on the table. Just showing them to users, and that could be super simple, of like drawing something on a napkin and then seeing what users have to say about it. And you want to get a little bit more nuanced with what you want to learn about it, but that can be great in like pivoting before you overinvest in an idea that seems really cool to you.
Yeah, I'm like shocked, but also thrilled, and know that this is because you were there, to hear that 60% of the hackathon time was dedicated to research and 40% was dedicated to hacking.
Right?
Music to my ears. Can you comment on how that affected the quality of the final products that were delivered?
Yeah. I mean, I think the solutions we came up with were not on anyone's radar before we started looking into the experience. So I think it not only impacted the quality of the solution, it impacted the direction that the solution was even pointing towards. And then being able to kind of quickly pivot and have easy access to users as you're hacking, I think really helped move people along in a better direction.
And when you say easy access to users, because you mentioned recruiting is hard before, how did that kind of work for you guys?
Yeah, so the solutions that we were building for were actually for our internal staff. So it was people who, like drivers, go to a place called a hub where they can talk to someone about a problem that they're having. So we were helping build tools for the kind of support agent. And so we were at the hub, and then they work there, so we could just have access to them as
captive
needed. Yeah. And they were stoked. They wanted us to help them. So definitely a captive audience.
It is amazing how often people that we're trying to help are in a situation where they would love help. So yeah, I'm with you on that. Last question for you, and then we'll let you get back to your real life, is how do you share results? Like, how do you know when you're done? And then how do you kind of like get the results in a place where you can share them? Because I imagine you could spend a lot of time making something look beautiful or like look very cohesive.
Yeah.
And yet like that wouldn't feel like a good use of time, but at the same time, not synthesizing or getting something to a completed state might be risky for later. How do you balance that out?
Yeah, I think it depends on the audience that you're presenting to. I think it depends on the gravity of the decision that you're trying to influence, and how much you're challenging people to pivot. So like, if I know I have to convince an executive to change their mind on something that research really vehemently like disagrees with, I'm going to put a lot of work into making that really strong. Because that's going to have a huge amount of impact. So those are some of the things that I weigh. I do think storytelling is very, very important. And the more that you can like get people to remember your data by having an emotional experience, by either hearing video or telling a story that they can relate to, I think that is more digestible and memorable than like showing a bunch of bullets with really, a lot of valid data points. So yeah, I think, you kind of have to like judge based on those variables, how much time you spend into it. And oftentimes what happens here, things move super fast at Lyft. So even if I like scope a certain project, it'll be like, oh, well, we need you to present the exec summary and product review tomorrow. I know you haven't had time to synthesize. There's always this like, I know you haven't had time, but can you just give me this one thing? And it's often the exec summary, which is usually last and kind of the hardest to crystallize. So sometimes it's kind of like taking off pieces while continuing to synthesize the broader story.
Yeah, and I think the big piece there that I'll add in too is this kind of forcing yourself to remain unbiased, like let the data do the talking. I mean, it can be so easy to pick out the pieces that align with the hypotheses we talked about earlier, but to really look at the data as objectively as possible and let it tell the story it needs to tell. I've definitely run into that with clients in the past where they're like, well, it'd be nice if the story would just be the use pieces and then the use pieces. So I think having kind of that real balance unbiased story is important.
Definitely. And I think also for people who are new at this, it's important to not pivot too quickly. So if you interview one person and they're like, oh, they didn't like this, let's change the design. And then, you don't have a sense, you can't see trends because you kept changing things along the way. So make sure you can change them midstream, but at least get 3 or 4 interviews down before you pivot, and then do 3 or 4 more so that you can make informed decisions. And if you have people coming in to listen to a study and they only see one, make sure that they're not going and jamming on what they heard from that single interview. These are definitely risks that happen all the time.
Totally. Thank you so much for taking time to chat with us today. Your insights, of course, are super valuable, and it's always fun to hear what you're up to in your career these days. But I'll let you go right on time, and look forward to chatting with you soon.
Okay. Thanks, Katie.
Thanks, Londa. Bye.